A very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first event under the banner Ambassadors Lecture Series this year. And it's very appropriate that we begin this with this year with a representative of a very key player, both global and regional. That's Russia. And more so because Russia is represented here today and in Singapore by a very distinguished member of the diplomatic service, Ambassador Leonid Moiseev. As you'd have seen from his CV, Ambassador Moiseev has had almost 4 decades of experience in foreign service and diplomacy. Much of which has been spent focused on China, actually. He specializes in China, speaks Mandarin also, has been associated with the earlier Russo-Chinese or Soviet-Chinese border disputes, border issues, has been a special representative of the President to SCO, to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for many years before taking up his post here. So very distinguished career, and I bid him a very warm welcome. Needless to say, we're all aware that Russia in all its forms and for centuries has been very deeply associated with South Asia. The Near East of Russia, of course, I mean, that's where the Mughals, etc., came from. But even in the 19th, 20th century, I was reading earlier today, or looking at anyway, the correspondence between Leo Tolstoy and Mahatma Gandhi in 2009-10, and how Tolstoy was involved with the Transvaal issues of Indians in Transvaal, the method of their struggle, and also the goals, the non-violent methods and the goals. What found resonance, what has always found resonance among South Asians is Tolstoy's War and Peace, for instance, of course, it's apparently about the Napoleonic Wars and all that, Solferino, etc., Moscow. But actually it's about the war within the human minds and hearts, and the way we seek to resolve those, calm those with peace. And that is the moral message of Tolstoy, which of course finds great resonance because it agrees with many of our South Asian values. But as I said, through the evolution of Russia in all its forms, even during the communist era, as we know that Bengal's M.N. Roy was a very close associate of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Afterwards, with India, Russia has had very close relations. Soviet Union was involved in the Tashkent in an attempt to resolve India-Pakistan, an intractable issue, of course, and later on, as we all know, in the Bangladesh War in 1971 as well. Some loosening of ties after the passing of the Soviet Union, but reinvigorated again. I was just telling Ambassador that I myself, when I visited Russia as a foreign advisor in the Kirgizstan government, I met up with Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, my colleague, counterpart, whom I knew very well in New York earlier. He's a man of prodigious parts, really, and very sharp intellect, very bright man with a very strong sense of history. And he was telling me that they are extremely interested in resuscitating these relationships with South Asia. Lavrov himself began his career in Sri Lanka, and he speaks Sinhalese actually. And he was telling me that there's a tremendous intellectual, spiritual, and most certainly now strategic interest in South Asia. Evidenced in a recent visit, of course, by our Prime Minister, to Russia in January when she signed this atomic accord and arms purchase deal, etc. But more than that, we get a sense of the very deep interest that Russia has now begun to evolve in our region. To speak to these and other issues, Ambassador Leonid Moiseev is here, and without further ado, I shall hand over the microphone to the Ambassador.
Thank you. It's a great privilege for me to speak to you today. Well, as you understand, I am not a big specialist on South Asian affairs, but through my latest assignments, especially during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I had to travel a lot through Central Asia, former Soviet Central Asia, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes now both Pakistan and India as observers. Sri Lanka is a dialogue partner in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and there are some other aspiring countries from South Asia who want to join also this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Well, I want to give you a little bit, I'd say, biased view, my biased view.
All right.
Yes. Of our relations with South Asian countries. Well, it was my idea, 6 centuries of successful cultural and economic exchanges. Well, the first direct contact between Russia and India was at the second half of the 15th century, when a very ambitious Russian merchant spent 3 years traveling to India and back to Russia. And so that was the first, at least historically established contact between our countries, between two vast regions. And what was even more important, it was a cultural and economic contact. And for many centuries, Russia, like many other European countries, was fascinated by India's culture, religious, and spiritual life. And especially in the 19th century in Russia, there was a vogue, yes, everybody, especially in the high society, were in this and that respect paying tribute to India's theosophic works, first of all. And Russia was also home to very significant and very prominent scholars who worked especially on Buddhism and Islam. Probably this fascination was because the two countries, I mean, first of all, of course, India and Russia, were far away and were not neighbors. Well, we had absolutely different history with China, which was our neighbor and had the longest border with the Soviet Union, and the longest land border in the world. That was another history of relationship. We had another history of relationship with India, which also had a small but very difficult border with Russia. India was something which was far away. Well, Himalayas were the natural border, but very interestingly, Russia, especially in the old Russia, in the Russian Empire period, tried to venture also into this region. Well, you know that we had in the 19th century, we had a very famous Russian historian who said that the history of Russia, Imperial Russia, was the history of expansion. And that's right to a certain extent, because Russia, from the very beginning, was expanding. Now is the biggest country in the world, both the biggest European and both the biggest Asian country. And the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century was a time of the big or grand game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. And Russia for had several unsuccessful attempts to encroach on the British interests in India. They were, I'd say, very bizarre attempts. Especially during the Napoleonic War, we had a very interesting Russian Tsar who was absolutely against England, which was our natural ally against Napoleon. And he, well, because he didn't like England, he sent several Cossack regiments to conquer India directly from Russia. The British envoy to St. Petersburg immediately organized a coup, and this Russian Tsar was killed. And the Cossacks were brought back, yes. So that was the first Russian bizarre venture into the South Asian continent. The second one was during the 19th century when Russia tried to expand in the southern direction, and of course the first and natural the closest way was through Persia or Iran. And it ended in 1907 when Russia and the British Empire, the two emperors met and they established a sort of status quo. Russia was allowed to be present in the northern part of Persia, and the British Empire kept the southern part of Persia, and Afghanistan, which was the way to India, Afghanistan was kept neutral. The second such agreement, very interestingly, was at the beginning of the Second World War in 1941, when Stalin and Churchill agreed to occupy Iran. The British occupied Iran from the south, the Soviet Union occupied Iran from the north, and that was a very practical step to ensure British Lend-Lease military convoys to go to Russia via Iran. So that was probably the closest Russia came towards South Asia. Russia, after the revolution in Russia, Russia was very supportive of anti-colonial movements in Asia, and the sympathy grew, especially with the Indian struggle for independence. And after 1947, yes, Soviet Union was one of the first countries to recognize Indian independence. Russia really was very prominent at that time in South Asia, and really probably the pinnacle of Russian influence was in 1965, 1966, during this war between Pakistan and India, when the Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Kosygin, brought two leaders of two countries together in Tashkent, that was in the Soviet Union, and the declaration between the two countries was signed, which was probably the foundation for further development of relations between Pakistan and India. Well, frankly speaking, India was always viewed by the Soviet Union through different, I'd say, through relationship with other major players in the world. First of all, China, then the United States, and after that, probably to a certain extent, Pakistan. Well, India was very important for us, for the Soviet Union, especially during the bad period of our relationship with China, as a natural counterbalance to China. That was obvious. And we were also at that time viewing India and probably Indonesia as the most important players in the non-aligned movement, which was considered to be anti-imperialist and to a certain extent a supporter of Soviet political goals in this part of the world. That was especially when the relationship with China was absolutely at the lowest level. And Russia exerted a certain influence on the peninsula. And one very interesting example, the Chinese chose to go to war with India when both the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in this Cuban crisis. So they couldn't do anything about it because they were practically on the brink of war with each other. So that was a time when was chosen for this war in Kashmir. Well, speaking about the new Russia, well, I'd say that of course the 90s, the first decade when new Russian leadership came to power, was to a certain extent a lost period for us. Well, frankly speaking, Russia was at that time on the brink of survival, frankly speaking. I was in Moscow at that time, so probably many of you were also there. And that was the time when commuting every day to my work at that time, I was thinking when everything stopped in Russia. Because the metro, which was the only means at that time of commuting, was on the brink of its capacity. Yes, it was operating only because the Soviet machinery was fine and still reliable. We were absolutely in the absolute mess, economically, politically, and Russia was begging for Western credits because that was the only means of survival of this huge country. Salaries were not paid, pensions were not paid. I don't know how people, of course it's a very resilient people, but how we survived. Because you know that I always give an example. I was department chief in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a very high position diplomat. And my salary for 6 years in the 90s was $200 a month. And I had survived on this $200 a month for 7 years, going to work, feeding my family, feeding my parents. Well, and we got through. After 2000, there was a change, of course, economically and after that politically. The first visits to Asian countries were paid by Mr. Putin during his first term of presidency to China and India. That was very evident signal that these two countries are our key partners in Asia. Both with China and India, we signed declarations of strategic partnership. So India and China became our strategic partners in the world. That was very tremendously important moment. Since that, with India, we had summit meetings every year, right? Both bilateral and both on the sidelines of major international conferences. These two countries, China and India, were probably the most frequently visited countries by Russian leaders. And it remains at that. Both countries were the biggest recipients or the biggest partners for Russian armaments. And by the way, the difference between India and Russia since 2000 in military cooperation was that India always got a little bit better armaments than China. That was a policy. That was a policy because China was our neighbor and India was not our neighbor. Well, now India is #1 our partner in military field, and of course it is tremendously difficult relationship. You know it from newspapers. Of course, it's much more difficult in real life, but it's tremendously effective and tremendously important for the two countries. Russia and India now have probably, well, to my opinion, probably Russia and India have the most versatile relationship among emerging market countries, so to say. With India, we have the whole set of relationships. I've mentioned already the military sphere, and the military sphere includes also military maneuvers, yes, and training. Yes, we also have very important relationship in heavy industry, especially in power generation. India is the second country which, in which Russia is building, or has already built, practically built, nuclear power station after China, and practically same two generation capacity in China, two generation capacity in India, and discussing two more, both in China and both in India. We have absolutely fantastic relationship in mutual investment. It's very, very interesting. India was the first Asian country, developing countries, investing in our oil production. In Sakhalin-1, India has about 20% stake in investment. And India now is receiving Russian oil and already signed up for liquid natural gas, which we haven't even produced. But we will produce it in the Arctic region of Russia. We have absolutely fantastic relationship and cooperation in IT technologies with India, naturally. We have absolutely fantastic relationship in pharmaceutics. Pharmaceutics is probably the most promising field in which we cooperate with India. And what is even more important and practically unique is that with India we have mutually established several spheres of cooperation in engineering or producing new technologies. Well, of course, military, at least two fields. Well, we are building with India, it's the only country in the world. Russia and India are cooperating on the new generation jet fighter. We are cooperating with India on the new generation of of missiles, yes, BrahMos, yes. Well, these are the missiles which the first version were delivered to China, but this will be a more advanced version. We are cooperating with India in various fields of fundamental sciences. So it's a tremendously important relationship. Well, unfortunately, the trade volume with India, between Russia and India, of course, it's not very big. It's a little bit less than 10 billion US dollars. So it's, for example, in comparison with China, it's 10 times smaller. But China receives 15 million tons of Russian oil every year. So this gives the biggest constitutes the biggest part of our trade. So relationship with India is fantastically important for us, and it's fantastically versatile. I've already said that it's probably the most versatile relationship between two emerging, so to say, two new countries. We also work very closely in international organizations, because India and Russia have practically similar or very close positions on the major international issues. Well, and the organization in which I worked for 6 years before coming to Singapore, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, well, India is an observer state. And 2 years ago, Indian foreign minister sent a letter to all our countries, SCO countries, asking for full membership in SCO. The problem, of course, is that Pakistan is also an observer state in SCO, and well, everybody understands that if we make any decision of enlarging the organization, we will have to take simultaneous decision on the two countries. So for 2 years, the application is there. So 2 years is a very promising new development within SCO. With India, Russia has a unique format. I mean, Russia, India, and China. It's a format of dialogue which nobody believed would work, but nevertheless it is working, and it is already well developed into more sophisticating discussion, because it's now not only global exchange on global political issues, but it's also turning as a very useful venue for discussing practical spheres of cooperation. For example, India is proposing to discuss agricultural cooperation within this framework, climate change and other issues as well. Well, Russia and India are together the founding fathers, BRICS, which is also a very interesting international body, which developed from practically only discussing the G20 agenda into a more sophisticated international venue. So India for Russia is probably one of the most important players, not only in South Asia, but a global player as well. Well, very briefly about other South Asian countries. Since Pakistan, different story, naturally. Pakistan, we had in the 50s, 60s probably, we had some developments with Pakistan economically, but then what was obvious, Pakistan had very close relationship with China, naturally, strategically. At the worst time of our relationship with China, it had very good relations with China, it still has very good relationship. Pakistan had very close relationship with the United States, and then the Afghanistan, well, the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, and Pakistan was de facto an enemy, direct enemy of the Soviet Union, because all the Taliban were trained in Pakistan. After 2000, after 9/11, well, we had radial sowing of relationship with Pakistan, because Pakistan at least well declared that it will join the fight against terrorism, and so we started to establish some sort of dialogue with Pakistan. Well, two of Pakistani presidents visited Russia, Musharraf and Zagdari, and no Russian president yet visited Pakistan. So we started from joint struggle against terrorism and anti-narcotics cooperation. So these are probably the two main issues of our dialogue with Pakistan now. With your country, with Bangladesh, it's a very robust relationship now. Well, I understand that you signed the consular document when you visited our country. We have very interesting relationship with Bangladesh, especially in energy sphere. It's Russia is assisting Bangladesh in developing of power generation capacity. About 20% of power generation in Bangladesh is produced by the Soviet or Russian-built plants. We have now cooperation in drilling for gas in Bangladesh. So it's very interesting. By the way, the volume of trade between Russia and Pakistan and Russia and Bangladesh is practically the same, yes, about $5 billion. And some words about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a very promising country, especially Mr. Lavrov, our foreign minister, is taking care of that. And it's booming tourism. Increased several times during the last several years. So it's a booming tourism. And well, we were, I'd say, supportive of Sri Lanka during this war against Tamil Tigers. And after the war, we established a very, I'd say, robust relationship. It's also energy. It's also prospecting for gas and oil. Very interesting cooperation. And well, for Russians who now go everywhere for tourism in big and bigger quantities, yes, Sri Lanka is one of the biggest attractions, yes, to this country. So that's my just assessments. I won't say that they are absolutely unbiased, but since I'm both well, part of my life was in the Soviet Union, part of my life is in Russia, so I'm still a little bit ideologically divided, yes. So
Thank you, Ambassador. It was not ideologically divided, but ideologically balanced. Balanced is the word. I mean, very succinctly put six centuries of relations between these two very important regions. I mean, the Russian region, both as the former Soviet Union or even earlier, than Russia, and then the Indian region, South Asia, and then you went into descriptions of with individual key countries of South Asia. This is something that I know for certain. Yeah, it's true that I did sign the consular agreement when I went to Russia, and we started discussing the nuclear power agreement as well. I mean, power generation is an area when Russia has taken very great interest.